When they're out there doing a Metcon, they feel like their endurance is lacking. Either their legs are burning or, their heart is pumping so hard.
And people love to like sweat and breathe and feel like they've gone really hard. And so everyone's always looking for that next step and like, how can I get better in that feeling? And so they always go into kind of the endurance mindset, when in reality, what we've seen in the past is most people probably need...
Because it's entirely possible that the limitation that you feel is not the same limitation that you actually have.
The challenge is most people feel really good when they add in those second sessions, and they maybe do them for 2 or 3 weeks, but then all of a sudden they're like completely trashed, and then they hit this plateau, and it takes a long time to dig out of that.
And if you only have 2 hours, 5 days a week, using up 2.5 or 3 hours of that for low intensity endurance work when it could be spent doing... Do you have your microphone?
Can you hear me?
He always has his microphone.
Chris has got the mic.
We're back.
We're back again.
We did an episode that took off a lot more than our other episodes. I think right now it's at 17K and over 140 questions, and it was about upgrading your endurance. And we promised this episode where we'd answer a lot of the questions down in the comments. Boys, no pressure.
We've got a lot of questions to go through, but the one thing that I think Kyle and I were just talking about this before we started, the interaction that we got from the endurance podcast was much more than, let's say, we've done like a movement efficiency podcast in the past. And why is that? Well, because most people that are in the sport of CrossFit especially feel like endurance is always lacking, and people love to like sweat and breathe and feel like they've gone really hard. And so everyone's always looking for that next step and like, how can I get better in that feeling? And so they always go into kind of the endurance mindset, when in reality, what we've seen in the past is most people probably need to kind of at least figure out a hierarchy of needs. And we wanted to explain that first. Like, as we get started today, talk about Zone 2 training, that's the whole podcast. But if you're someone that's listening to this and you think you need an endurance base, we want to kind of talk about a process that you can go through to make sure that you're getting that while still getting better at the other things in the sport.
Well, I think part of the reason that people really gravitate towards endurance is because that's the limitation that they feel, right? So when they're out there doing a Metcon, they feel like their endurance is lacking. Either their legs are burning or, their heart is pumping so hard, or the suffocation we talked about.
Breathing.
Ad nauseum last time. The problem is that the underlying cause of that feeling is not necessarily that you lack the endurance machinery that's going to be improved by Zone 2. So I think that we have to qualify all of this by saying that like your underlying limiter, or the thing that's holding you back from feeling better in those endurance Metcons, is not necessarily your cardiovascular system or your local muscular endurance. The most basic thing is movement efficiency. And
if we had posted a movement efficiency episode, we would have got 1K views and
no one was
questions.
interested.
Because people don't feel their movement quality affecting their Metcon performance in the same way that they feel their heart rate or the burning.
Totally.
But those things, your heart rate and your burning, can be dramatically affected by your movement quality.
Yeah.
Right? The way that you perform a thruster, if you imagine the following scenario, you do a thruster and you shift your knees way over your toes, so you rock forward onto your toes, you have a really crappy front rack where the bar's not actually resting on your shoulders.
It's off your shoulders.
It's floating in your hands off your shoulders. Now,
your wrists are hurting, your elbows hurt because you're off your shoulders.
Do a max rep set of that where, the bar's 6 inches in front of your midline and you're shifted way over your toes. Like, your quads are going to be exploding with fatigue because you're shifted so far onto your toes. You're not recruiting any posterior chain at all to help you through that movement. Then your triceps and shoulders are going to be completely blown up. And so it's going to feel like this local muscular limitation in the quads and shoulders. But in reality, it's because you have a crappy front rack and you're actually not sitting back in a decent squat position. So
that image you just painted of the person on their toes and the bars in the front rack out in front of them and they're fighting through a rep, I imagine that, if ever any of us made it to the fiery gates of hell, we'd open those gates and that would be the first thing we see.
Everyone is doing thrusters.
Some just shitty thruster rep.
Poor movement thrusters.
Your job here in hell is to fix all of the movement. No!
I think that is the first step. And we've talked about it in the past. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I do think with all of the responses, all the questions that we've received over the last week, we just want to make sure that people understand that even though you may be endurance limited, you may have a delivery limitation, your heart is not doing what it's supposed to do, there are other low-hanging fruit or things that maybe are more important on the hierarchy of needs that you should address either first or at least at the same time to get better at the sport of CrossFit. So a perfect, yes.
I was going to say, can we qualify that a little bit? If we know that we always, a lot of us instinctively look at the top athletes, right? The people who are at the games who already have lots of things squared away. Maybe we shouldn't follow them. We should look at back what they did to get there, right? So where, for the average person that you guys coach, where on that hierarchy, like, is the endurance? Like, if I clicked on that episode and I think it's really important, you know, and hold your hands up so the people watching can see what I'm doing.
Oh,
yeah, there you go. And then where is it actually?
I think we should have you answer this first, Brandon, because you coach a much wider range of people because of your involvement in the TTT Compete program. And
right.
I tend to coach people that are, you know, either at the bubble semifinal level or the semifinal level or at the bubble games level or masters competitors that are at the bubble games level. So I want to let you address that first because your answer is going to be more broadly applicable to everyone listening to this podcast. And then I can chime in on some of the high level stuff.
The easy answer to that, Chris, is everyone still should be doing endurance work. And we believe, this is why we talked about Zone 2 work, that it's extremely important. And we're going to talk about, I think we'll dive in maybe a little bit of the science today about why it's important and what it can do for you. So it's not that it's not important. It's that it is only one piece of the puzzle when you're talking about a performance-based sport. So if we're just saying like health and longevity, people need to be doing a lot of Zone 2 work because there's some very clear science. The data backs that up. That's going to help with health and longevity. But if I'm in a sport that requires me to do muscle ups and thrusters and handstand push-ups, do sprint type workouts, run outside, then do a long workout, you have to be very well balanced in all of those things, which means you have to have good movement efficiency, which Kyle already alluded to. You have to have really good strength and strength endurance. And you have to have really good gymnastic skills. Now, all of those things you have to have with a big endurance base. But even if you have a big endurance base, if you can't do muscle ups, it doesn't really matter in the sport. Like, you're just bottlenecked by that movement. And what we see, what we see in Compete, because we have a big online group, is the level of athlete that comes in. Most of them cannot do one or two of the skills. And almost all of the athletes that come in, either in one-on-one coaching or those that are in our online program, have at least one or two movements that they are quote unquote weak in compared to the norms that we see at the games or semifinal level. And so if your goal is to reach the semifinal level, and let's say the average snatch for a male is now 270 plus pounds, but you can only snatch 185 pounds, that is a need that is like the lowest hanging fruit. We have to get you stronger if you want to reach those goals or get as close to those goals as possible, even if your endurance is lacking. Because, again, you can build your endurance all year round, but if your snatch stays at 185, that's going to be the thing on the leaderboard that holds you back the most. Whereas your endurance can lack, but if you get stronger, you actually move up the leaderboard faster. So all we're talking about here is make sure that you're looking at these needs, look at what's most reasonable with your training program, and then look at the things that will move you up the leaderboard the fastest. And we want to make sure that we're taking care of those as well. Now, go ahead.
To your point, Brannen, if someone had an infinite amount of training time, then you would say, all right, we can build in this endurance base. But most people have, 60 minutes to 2 hours to train. And if you only have 2 hours, 5 days a week, so you have this, kind of 10 hours of training block, using up 2.5 or 3 hours of that for low intensity endurance work when it could be spent doing technical development on your lowest hanging fruit, components, that makes a lot more sense if what you're trying to do is get better at the sport of CrossFit.
Side note, there's like some people with real, let's just call it real jobs, real life going on, and they just heard that and they're like, there's some go-getters out there who are going to be like, well, I can add that in, and they can. But what they forget is that when you add that in, now something else in your life slipped away, and that stress will catch up with you at some point. Like, oh, I put this off, and that, and then when you rather them less stressed out over time than adding the
especially
40 minutes of Zone 2.
Less stressed out, especially if they're trying to get stronger, because, and we'll do a strength podcast at some point and talk about like what are the most basic things that you need to do for strength. But if you want to get stronger, people that are listening, like I said this last time, like don't do Zone 2 running if you want to get stronger, but also like reduce your stress and get more sleep. And if you're going to wake up early in the morning and, wake up at 5:30 a.m. to do your Zone 2 to get that extra volume in, that's going to take away from your ability to adapt to the strength work that you're doing. Sorry, that was a huge tangent, Brannen, from where you were going. But
I think it all ties in, right? So the whole point of this is this kind of a huge caveat we wanted to put at the beginning of this. And we're going to do podcasts on all the other things that we think are important in the sport. So Kyle just talked about strength. We'll talk about skill development and how to acquire new skills, because that is so important, especially with Bosman doing handstand pirouettes or now weighted vest muscle-up complexes and all of the other things that are coming out in the sport. They'll probably come downstream, right? So you'll see those trickle down, and they'll be in the open, and they'll be in quarterfinals. And so if you want to be good at the sport, you also have to have those things developed well. And again, it takes time to learn how to move well in a muscle up or a handstand push up or to do the Olympic lifts. And so we just want to make sure that people understand you can't forget about those things just because you feel like your engine is lacking. Now, you could do those things together, and we'll talk about how you can do that well. There's some good questions in here about how to do that. But I just want to make sure that people understand you need to do a true assessment. And if you're in our program or you have a training think tank coach, they're doing that process for you. And that's probably why you're not doing 2 hours of zone 2 work, but 2 hours every couple of days of strength work instead, because that would be your lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah, I think so. So, that's kind of the broad overview of where the, I don't know if I would call it the average CrossFitter, but
yeah, I mean, everyone that comes in is much more, they're above average. They're top 10 or 15%, but it's not a games level athlete.
Yeah. So then talking about the athletes that are in that semifinal level that are trying to break into the games level, or games level that are trying to break into the top 10, I think the conversation is very different, because those athletes are 8 to 12 years, maybe even more than that, maybe even, 8 to 13 or 14 years into competitive CrossFit, and likely have gone through years of skill progressions of handstand walking and ring muscle ups and snatches, and have probably snatched way over the average, right? So if we say the average semifinal competitor snatching 270, these guys might be snatching 295 or 300, right? So they're beyond the bell curve. So if we're talking about those athletes, now we're talking about what is the lowest hanging fruit for them. And then it does become endurance work. If you have 10 or 12 or 14 years of CrossFit specific experience, doing more CrossFit is going to reap a limited reward, right? You're going to get limited adaptations from that. On the flip side, what have you probably not done? You've probably not done 4 or 5 hours of zone 2 low intensity endurance work to build, the highest levels of mitochondrial and capillary density in the muscle. You haven't likely done that. And so now you have this thing that you can start to attack. But to keep in mind, we're talking about 2 completely different populations. And in that last podcast, I did mention that, I thought for an elite CrossFitter, that 2.5 hours was kind of like the baseline level of zone 2 per week. But keep in mind that I mentioned that was for the elite CrossFitter. And I think a lot of people took the 2.5 hour recommendation. They're like, oh, this is a blanket recommendation. No, that was for the population that, I tend to work with.
Right. And those people are doing it full time. So they have the time. Chris talked about this. If you have a full-time job, it's very challenging to do 2 long sessions. But, Travis out there, this is his job. So he has 8 or 10 hours in a day, and he's trying to figure out, okay, where are my sessions? How am I fitting them in? And it's easy for him to fit in a long session.
Yeah, 90 minutes of zone 2 is just part of his daily routine.
Correct. So essentially what you're saying is the games level athlete, he or she can raise their ceiling more by doing the longer aerobic work, which we'll talk about why in a second, as opposed to just continuing to do hard CrossFit, because most likely they have every single skill. They already have all the strength metrics that are needed. And the only other thing that I would say that may be missing is movement speed. But if you've been doing it for 12 years, they've probably figured out how to move as fast as possible on each of those movements.
And they're likely adaptable in it as well. So if they see someone using a technique that's slightly faster than what they're doing, they can watch it and replicate it really quickly.
And we see that on site. Like Alexis has done that so well over the last couple of years. She's modified, wall walk technique or muscle up technique based on what she's seen other people do. And now she's just as efficient as everyone else.
Yeah, I think this is obviously not on the topic of endurance, but it's related. Some of the best athletes that I've worked with are just the best thieves. They basically watch other people move and steal what works well.
Totally.
And adopt that movement. And then because they have already built an engine, they can express their, endurance capacity through that new movement technique, which makes them better and better and better and better.
Yeah.
So, okay.
All right. We some questions?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions. The first one is kind of the overarching question, which a lot of people just wanted us to better define what zone 2 training is and what it's actually good for. So I think let's start there, and then we'll dive into some of the specific questions after that.
Okay. So zone 2 is based on I mentioned this last time, but I think this is important to reiterate because it was definitely missed based on some of the questions, is based on a 5-zone heart rate model.
Yeah.
All right. To determine your zone 2, you have to know what your max heart rate is. And I think it's also critically important to point out that your max heart rate is going to be movement dependent. And what I mean by that
is super important. So listen to this piece. Your
max heart rate running is going to be different than your max heart rate on a bike. All right. And there's a whole bunch of physiological reasons for that. The most important one is the amount of muscle mass that's required to complete the movement. The more muscle mass that's required, likely the higher your heart rate is going to be in each of those movements. So with a bike where you're seated, right, you don't have as much postural stability, especially on like a Concept 2 bike,
right,
where your arms are almost completely uninvolved and you're seated on a static seat and you don't have to balance, then it's just your legs doing the work. Well, your heart rate is not going to be able to get as high there because you're not using as much muscle mass. And likely your limiter is going to be entirely local fatigue in the legs.
Right.
Like if you go do a max heart rate test on a Concept 2 bike, you're going to crap out because your legs are burning so bad, not because you've actually reached a true max heart rate. But if you do it running, most people are going to be able to reach closer to a max heart rate. So that should illustrate that like your max heart rate running is different than your max heart rate. Rowing is different than your max heart rate. On the ski erg is different than your max heart rate. Cycling is different than your max heart rate. Swimming, which actually swimming elicits fairly low max heart rates relative to running and things like that. Because power output
than Fran.
And way different than Fran.
Yeah.
And for a whole different reason that I don't know if we'll actually address. But as soon as you add external loads, then your heart is pushing against blood pressure. So every time we talk about that thruster example from the beginning of the podcast, even if you have great thruster mechanics, holding that load in front rack increases blood pressure, right? There's tension that's created. Anytime you tense a muscle, it's increasing the pressure that the heart's pushing against. And so then you have the heart pushing against increased pressure, which changes heart rate. So
yeah, it'll make it increase rapidly, and then you're not actually filling your heart correctly.
The basic here is that you're going to need to know, if you're going to do zone 2 work running, you're going to need to know what your max heart rate is running. If you're going to do it on the Concept 2 bike, you're going to need to know what your max heart rate is on the bike.
Right.
Then the zones are based on a percentage of your max heart rate. And the easiest way to define zone 2 is that it's 60 to 70% of your heart rate max. So to keep this simple, if your heart rate max is 200 beats per minute, so that would be someone that's probably like in their early 20s, would likely be around 200 beats per minute, then they're going to be looking anywhere between 120 to 140 beats per minute for their zone 2.
Right.
Now, you can make this more accurate, right? So those zones, that 60 to 70% zone 2, that's an average, right? It's like based on most people, it's going to be 60 to 70%. But you can make that more accurate. If you use a NIRS device like a Moxie, Evan has talked about that. You can actually create zones based on when your muscles start to desaturate, right? So that's going to be most accurate. But most people don't have access to that,
right.
So we're not going to worry about that. Then you could go get VO2 max testing. And using VO2 max testing, you can determine a heart rate that correlates to specific zones. And it might be higher or lower than that 60 to 70% of your heart rate max. But then the one that's most accessible to people is heart rate, right? So that's kind of where you meet accessibility and accuracy. That's where they kind of intersect the best is using heart rate. But then below that, you have, most people who have practiced nose breathing during exercise could likely perform relaxed nose breathing. I don't even know if it would be relaxed, but nose breathing exercise and, run while just breathing through their nose. And that would likely be around their zone 2. And if you get to the point that you have to open your mouth and start breathing, then you've likely gone outside of your zone 2. Now that's not going to be exact. And some people have blockages and deviated septums, and there's all that individual variability there. But then the other one is to be able to have a conversation, 10 to 20 word conversation without feeling out of breath. And that's another way, the talk test, to kind of determine your zone 2. So those are like, from a most basic perspective, zone 2 is going to be that heart rate 60 to 70% based on that 5-zone model of your max heart rate. But there's other ways to determine it. And that is, the heart rate is probably the best from an accessibility and accuracy perspective.
It's super easy. If you have a polar heart rate monitor, you can wear one of the wearables on your wrist too. Those are a little less accurate, but Garmin does a really good job with some of their watches that is accurate enough. I love just the breath test. And Kyle already talked about that. Another way, even when most people are in zone 2, I think that there's actually some pretty good research on this. I was just reading something before the podcast. Essentially, when you get into that zone 2, before you start to get almost like spill over to where now there's, too much CO2, that's when your respiration rate actually increases, right? Where it's balanced, and that's where zone 2 is, it's deeper breathing when you're running or biking or skiing, wherever you're at.
Yeah.
But it's not an elevated respiration rate. So that's a really good way to know that I'm still staying in this. But as soon as you feel like you're because you're trying to expel as much CO2 as possible, you probably spilled over into zone 3. Now, that's not as accurate, again, as some of the other things Kyle talked about, but that's a really good way. If you don't, like at home, sometimes I forget my heart rate monitor here or I don't have it on, I'll use that as kind of my testing body to make sure I'm staying within that zone 2.
From an experience perspective, it feels comfortable.
Yes.
You're definitely working, but it feels comfortable.
Yeah.
And, everyone is going to start at a different place. I think this is also really important to talk about. We touched on this last time in the podcast, and that is that people can start walking. Like, there is definitely a subset of the group that's listening to this podcast now that could go out and do a very brisk walk and likely get into their zone 2 heart rate range. But there's also another group that used to do marathons where I've seen Ryan. Ryan, TTT coach who runs marathons. I've seen him running on the True Form with his heart rate at 100 beats per minute, running 9.5 minute pace.
Right.
And he was having 30-word in-depth intellectual conversations with me
totally
while
fine.
I was walking on the treadmill next to him with my heart rate higher.
Yeah, he's well trained for that. And most people can't do that with running. And to Kyle's point earlier, this is another question that we had about, what's the problem with running in strength training? The challenge with doing zone 2 run work is there's more chance of there being a bunch of waste byproduct in the legs that will challenge or interfere with a lot of the strength training that you want to do. And it's really hard to regulate that in a zone 2 session. So you got to be really careful with that. I think the other thing too, I just lost my,
But on the topic of running, I think one of the big problems that people run into, especially if they're running on the road, is impact.
Eccentric loading is what I was going to say. Yeah.
So just the fact that the legs are constantly taking on this, mini bounding. I talked about last time, part of the reason I chose zone 2 running was to get some of that bounding adaptation. But that is also the thing that can potentially prevent some leg strength adaptation. So if you're doing a heavy squat cycle and you are also doing zone 2 running on the road, you're potentially introducing 2 interfering training adaptations. Right. And if you really need to get stronger, that's a really bad choice for your zone 2.
So the benefit of doing zone 2 work can be to improve the preloading of the heart, to actually create some elasticity in the heart, to get more blood volume into the heart so that when you do some of the higher intensity intervals that we've talked about in the past, or you're doing CrossFit style work or weightlifting, powerlifting, then you can work on the kind of contraction of the heart. So you're getting both the preload and the afterload, which is obviously getting more blood in so that you can pump more blood out efficiently. But with that said, zone 2 work then needs to focus on making sure that you're getting blood into the heart as opposed to it being local stamina. So this is a kind of the last caveat here. Most people jump into zone 2 and then they go too hard, where if I'm running, my legs are burning the entire time, I'm beating myself up, I'm not doing the same thing as I think that I'm doing in that endurance session.
Yeah, if your legs are feeling that kind of local fatigue and burning, then there's tension in the legs. And I touched on this before, but to clarify this point, anytime that you've increased muscular tension in the body beyond not full relaxation, but beyond what you would expect from relaxed running, like zone 2 kind of, comfortable running. Once there starts to be this extra tension, then the heart's pushing against more pressure, and that pushing against more pressure also means that the heart is filling less. There's less, return to the blood. So you're getting less stretch with each.
This is a good analogy that I heard. It would be like pumping up your bike tire, right? Everyone's done this before, and you're just joking around. You go, and the bike tire's not really pumping up because you're going really fast with the pump. You're not actually getting any blood through or air through
letting
to the
pump
tire.
Fill.
So we want to actually get those long, aggressive pumps. If that sound makes any sense, but that's actually going to get that tire full, and then obviously now you can ride your bike. Same thing here. We want to improve the efficiency of the heart, and if you're always going a little too hard, you may be improving the ability to contract the heart well, but you're not actually learning how to fill the heart appropriately.
Well, this actually,
Brannen, you better not do anything bad to me ever, because I'll find that clip and use it against you.
Yeah, sorry, that was bad.
Well, Brannen's point here actually explained. There was a question about, why can't, and I'm going to butcher the question a little bit, but it's basically like, why can't I do 30 minutes of wall ball? Well, obviously you can't do 30 minutes straight of wall ball. That would be impossible. Why can't I do 30 minutes of intermittent wall ball and keep my heart rate in zone 2? And
yeah, let me ask you that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So would 30 minutes of wall balls in very small sets with a large work to rest ratio work for training this zone? That way you'd be training the skill as well.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to address this question right here, where Brannen was just talking about cardiac preload, afterload, and cardiac filling, is that, okay, you have this external load, you're holding a wall ball out in front of you, and one of the things that adding load is going to do, like I was just talking about, is increases tension. And by increasing tension, you're increasing the resistance to blood flow. You're increasing the resistance on the heart. And by doing that, you're changing the types of adaptations that are occurring from your training. So with low intensity zone 2 work, what we're trying to accomplish is we're trying to build capillary density in the tissues, mitochondrial density in the muscles, and we're trying to increase the amount of blood that the heart fills with and pumps out each time. So the cardiac efficiency is essentially. So like that's what we're trying to accomplish with our low intensity zone 2. And that can really only be done with continuous kind of low load, low resistance exercise. It can't be done with externally loaded
Essentially,
movements.
you have to let that, to go back to that analogy, you have to let the pump fill with air so that I can get air back into the tire. That's what I have to be able to do with my heart. And if I'm always creating load, then it's only filling up halfway and then trying to pump out to get to the local areas of your body.
So essentially, you have to be able to do continuous. And your goal is to be able to eventually do way more than 30 minutes of continuous exercise. And doing, 5 wall ball, resting 20 seconds, 5 wall ball, resting 20 seconds, that's not continuous exercise. Even though you are in this work rest environment, you're never going to get to the point that you could do unbroken wall ball for an hour. So that would be a really poor choice of exercise if your goal is to get these very specific types of adaptations that build your aerobic base. Now, with that,
where could it be good for?
With that being said, 30 minutes of intermittent wall ball like that is actually a great way to build wall ball efficiency. So if you did something like 10 wall ball on the minute for 30 minutes, now granted, that's a lot of wall ball, right? I mean, you're looking at 300 wall ball, but there have been plenty of CrossFit workouts that have had that. That would be a great way to build mechanics, efficiency, to build some specific adaptations to wall ball. And if you jumped on the bike between it and maintained your heart rate around that zone 2 as kind of like a recovery thing, then you're looking at creating that's a good piece for creating wall ball specific adaptations or sport specific adaptations. That would be, in my mind, we talked about the bridge last time where you're doing your low intensity zone 2 aerobic work. And then you have the sport over here, which would be like 150 wall ball for time. In the middle of that might be something like every minute on the minute for maybe 20 minutes. I might not go for 30 minutes, but depending on the level of athlete, maybe you would, where you do 10 wall ball and then hop on the Echo bike or hop on the Concept 2 bike between them and kind of spin as an active recovery. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, increase the intensity of that spin or increase the weight of the wall ball or go to 11 feet or whatever it is. So I'm not saying in any way, shape or form that that's bad training for CrossFit. I'm just saying that that isn't going to achieve the type of adaptations that we're talking about that you're going to achieve with low intensity zone 2 type continuous aerobic
your
training.
heart rate could actually stay within that quote unquote zone 2, but it's not eliciting the same adaptation that Kyle's talking about with actual zone 2 training on a bike or running. But to his point, it can help with the skill. Like if I may give people EMOMs or intervals of, let's say, wall balls and something else, and the focus is do this with your feet, practice squatting to a lower depth, whatever it may be, right? Or catching the ball in the bottom of a squat. Like there are all kinds of skill adaptations that you can create there. And then again, it is a really good bridge as you go from kind of that base building time into the performance side of the sport as you get closer to the season.
Let's dig into some questions.
Yeah, I think the first one is how do you distinguish between if you're endurance limited and locally or stamina limited at a local level? And we started with that last time, but obviously we didn't make that as clear as we should have. So I think let's start there and then we'll get to some of the specific ones.
Yeah, I think the first and easiest way to address this is that regardless of what type of endurance adaptation you have, whether it's stamina based or, more cardiovascular based or delivery limited, whatever language you want to use to communicate those things. The first thing you have to do is address movement quality, because it's entirely possible that the limitation that you feel is not the same limitation that you actually have. Like my thruster example from the beginning of the podcast. So once we've addressed that, like I have to give that caveat to begin. Once we've addressed that, then I think the next step is to really pay attention to how you feel in the workouts that you do on a daily basis. And what is the most common thing that you experience? There's going to be plenty of people that are listening to this podcast that fall into the gray area where both are a limitation. And it turns out, if that's the case, follow a balanced program, right? But if you're like Brannen was, where like he said, he never felt out of breath. No matter what he did, it was not like he just couldn't work hard enough, quote unquote.
Yeah, I would just get bottlenecked by lat fatigue, biceps fatigue, leg fatigue, whatever it may be.
Or someone who always feels like they're out of breath. 7 minutes in, 5 minutes into the Metcon, I have to stop and just stare at the implement. And someone even mentioned that in the podcast. I really empathized with them in the comments when they're
I know how you feel.
What do I do? And I'm staring at it. And it's like, well, the solution is not to just go back and do it over and over. It's to actually go back and build your underlying cardiovascular system. But you have to know yourself and observe enough to figure out what your trend is across CrossFit workouts, across sport-specific workouts. You're not going to be able to just do one test and be like, I'm all this or I'm all that. And the reality is that the majority of the people that are listening to this podcast are probably pretty balanced. You and I were on opposite ends of the spectrum as a result of the way that we've trained, our genetics, things like that. So we ended up on opposite ends, not because that's normal, but because of our specialization in sports prior to this. So I think that's an important starting point is, first, check movement quality. Second, observe everything that you do and pay attention. Take notes.
Take notes. That's what I was going to say. I think that's just so important in sport. Every other sport, people are always taking notes after a practice or after a game. Like I remember playing football and we had cameras every single practice so that we could come back and we would review even in a practice. And in the same way, we should be doing that with our sport, where even if it's a fun workout with friends, just write down, jot down 2 or 3 sentences of how that felt and then look at the trends, as Kyle said, over time.
I did the partner workout, Joe, with Haley this past week in the memorial workout, and I had a suffocation style limitation. Like I was in the 3rd round of the burpee box jump over double under, and I felt like I was, my respiration was getting up already. And I'm like, man, if I didn't have Haley to offset some of this fatigue, my limitation in this, moving on to the overhead squats, would be me just standing, staring at the barbell, breathing heavy before the overhead squats.
Yeah.
But I know in the last podcast I said I had stopped doing all my zone 2 work after semifinals. I started up last week. So.
You realize, okay, I'm gonna check.
And
this
I was slow. Like the deterioration of my pace. God, it was like I've added like a minute and a half or more to my zone 2 pace. Now we can talk about zone 2 paces and things like that, because I think there's some questions in there that would address
we'll get
it.
To that. But I think that's a good point, though. You know that you felt those things in the workout because you're reviewing every single workout. So I think that's just really important. Like, that's something that everyone can apply right now. Write down a couple thoughts after every workout, your strength training, your skill work, and your conditioning, so that you know exactly what you need to work on. And it gives you more focus moving forward. Like you can set these micro goals of like, oh, the last week has been I've struggled with these things. So start working on that, or talk to a coach, or if you're in compete, you can reach out to us and we can kind of guide that process.
Then I think the other thing to discuss is the fact that regardless of what the source of limitation is, regardless of whether it is a cardiovascular limitation or a stamina limitation, in the end, what you're trying to do is get better at a CrossFit workout.
Yes.
And so choosing methods that improve that, regardless of the type, right? We could get really specific. We talked about NIRS earlier. We could do NIRS testing and really determine whether it's a delivery or a utilization limitation. We can determine that. But in the end, since most people don't have access to that, what you want to do are choose methods that are going to just improve that. And for most people, doing some zone 2 is going to build some stamina in the muscle groups that are trained during your zone 2 erg, and it's going to build cardiovascular endurance. And if you have a clear stamina limitation or muscular endurance limitation, then doing local muscular endurance work is also going to challenge the heart in that specific movement, right? So if it's a thruster limitation and you're doing high volumes of moderate load thrusters, like your heart's also going to adapt to the work that you're doing. So in the end, our goal is to improve performance, and either one is going to be moving you in that direction.
Yeah. The last piece I would say here is going back to when we say movement efficiency. Kyle said that's the first piece. It could be as simple as, how can I reduce my effort on a specific movement each rep? And we keep using the thruster example, but that's a super simple one because it is a full body movement. There's so many things that could be like the bottleneck. But if it's, I have a really bad front rack, start to improve that. We have a movement mobility path in our online program, or if you have a coach, there's plenty of things online that you can find. Improve your front rack position, and all of a sudden you'll be able to breathe better. You'll feel more efficient. You'll actually be able to press it off of your shoulders, almost like a push press, as opposed to it just being a strict press when you're coming up, and now you're using less effort. You're probably not holding your breath anymore, so you'll feel more efficient at the movement, which will make, obviously, the entire workout easier.
Yeah, and may expose a different endurance limitation.
Exactly. You mentioned that doing zone 2 running will ruin strength gains. We kind of talked about this, so let's go back to it. What about targeting muscle endurance? Is it possible to address the limiter in conjunction with strength?
Heck yeah, people have been doing this. If you think about like West Side, you think about West Side Barbell, right? So their whole thing was like they would do, something super heavy. They'd build a max of a lift that they wouldn't use in competition. I don't know how much people know about West Side Barbell and
max
that
effort day.
Okay. Yeah. Those basically, they have a max effort day. And on top of that, they'd have their repetition method, right? Where they're doing relatively higher volumes for them, 6 to 8 reps, 6 to 12 reps of a movement, like, a deep box squat or something like that as an assistant movement. Well, they're training muscular endurance for their sport. And then they would also layer on things like heavy, long sled drags, more muscular endurance. And they do it for the posterior chain or the anterior chain. So like, you have some of the strongest athletes in the world, and they're training local muscular endurance work on top of their absolute strength work. So the answer to that is absolutely.
And it works really well. Their system is awesome.
I use those styles of training often for athletes that need to get stronger. But what I do is I also reduce the volume of basic aerobic work that they're getting down to what I would consider kind of the bare minimum for the level that they compete at.
Sure.
So
I think the
short
challenge
answer is yes.
Yes. And just real quick, as a piece of that, I think the challenge with most people is they think muscular endurance work has to be like CrossFit intervals, and it does not. And we'll get into that. But what I mean by that is like, okay, I do my strength work. Say I'm doing a West Side, I'm doing a max every day. And then my muscular endurance piece to that is like, I'm going to do 3 sets of 21, 15, 9 of lunges and C2 bike and burpees. Then you may be interfering with the strength gains that you're trying to achieve. Whereas we could isolate the muscular endurance work, that 8 to 12 rep range, maybe longer rest breaks, so 3 minutes. So my intensity in the 8 to 12 reps is a little bit higher, and I'm actually targeting what I'm trying to work on for the strength adaptation.
Well, even some of the stuff I've seen in Compete about a month ago, where it would have been like you would do your max effort strength work, and then you would go into let's say 20 barbell back rack walking lunges directly into a 200-foot reverse sled drag.
Yep.
Rest equals work, or rest to recovery. Do 4 sets of that. Like that's local muscular endurance for the legs, but mostly the quads. And that's not going to interfere dramatically or even at all, and may even augment some of the strength adaptations from your max effort day.
Totally.
So like I almost look at that as like it could be hypertrophy work in some sense of the word.
Yeah. If you know you need endurance work and you want to include 2 to 3 zone 2 sessions on a runner per week, how would you layer those into your current training?
Okay. What I did is I just layered them on top of whatever Adam was writing for me.
Okay.
So to be clear, I would just kind of like pick and choose. I know that, my legs are going to be trash, so I don't want to do it before I'm doing my heavy strength work. That is one thing I did. So if I had heavy strength work in the afternoon, then when I did my morning zone 2 stuff, I would keep it on the bike instead of the runner, because I found the runner created more, fatigue going into the strength work. But really, I mean, it should be low enough intensity, and there should not be very much fatigue byproduct buildup. Hydrogen ions, whatever you want, like people colloquially know it as lactic acid.
Oh shit! I got too much hydrogen ions.
Not near as cool,
dude. It's not.
I gotta cut this back.
It's not lactate or lactic acid, but I don't want to dig into that conversation.
Well, what's funny is like when I got my degree, this would have been 2011 exercise science degree.
Yeah.
They already knew then it wasn't that, but
dude,
we still
I got mine in 2007, and we knew then it
I guess there's a lot of things in life where you just keep saying the lactate threshold just because people know what you mean.
And that is a thing, right? There is a lactate threshold. We're going to move on from that. With that being said.
So you layered it in.
Yes.
This person is actually someone that's in Compete, and I know many people have asked us in our online program, or we've actually had people reach out that are following other programs and like, hey, I want to do your endurance track. How would I integrate that into my training plan as is? There are some challenges there. And I think that my worry always as a coach, I always am thinking about, like, I'm setting up these guardrails. Like, I want you to be able to still take your own path and do the things that you love and enjoy your training, get excited about it each day, feel like you're making progress. So I'm there to collaborate with anybody I'm working with. But I also have to have something there on the side of the road when we're climbing up the mountain so you don't fall off. The challenge is most people feel really good when they add in those second sessions, and they maybe do them for 2 or 3 weeks, but then all of a sudden they're like completely trashed, and then they hit this plateau, and it takes a long time to dig out of that. So I would just be very thoughtful about how much you do. Ease into it, maybe only add 1 session a week and then a second session, and just make sure that you're still creating the adaptations that you want. Now, the biggest thing, and Kyle already talked about this, when you're doing that zone 2 training, you should not be creating that byproduct. The fatigue byproduct, I think, is what happens when most people in the sport feel like they're working hard. They feel the burn, and that feels good to them. And so they feel like in zone 2 work, they need to feel the same thing, right?
Yes.
The challenge, though, is that then you're just overtraining, or you probably will be overtraining if you do that 2 or 3 times a week, where now you're in zone 4 on a run, like you're doing 1 mile repeats, basically. It just probably won't work well with a good strength program. Now, that's not to say I've seen Travis do that and still get better. If I do that, I get worse.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So I just think that you have to be very thoughtful, and maybe some people are just better at handling the volume.
Yeah, I think to your point, zone 2 should not create a lot of localized fatigue or lingering localized fatigue. Like, your legs will feel heavy if you did it on the bike or the runner. But what you should have more of is just this kind of systemic fatigue where it's like you're kind of tired afterward. And I don't mean like my arms are tired or my legs are tired, but like you're actually like a little bit sleepy tired afterward. And that's more of a central nervous system fatigue. Again, not something that I want to dig into too much in this podcast because I want to address a lot of questions, but you should expect some central fatigue from zone 2 work, but not a lot of local metabolic fatigue.
Right. That's important because you're going to get a lot of that from the CrossFit training you're doing, or just the strength training that you're doing. Yeah, I mean, if you're targeting a back squat, then you're going to get a lot of that fatigue in your legs, maybe even your low back. We don't want to double that up with, hard running intervals, unless, again, you're peaking for something.
Would you recommend the people that are following Compete that want to add more zone 2 endurance work to do it on like a Thursday, Sunday recovery days and choose low impact modalities, things like a ski erg or a Concept 2 bike?
I think the way I would look at this is I definitely wouldn't start with running unless you're like a Ryan, which we already talked about, who's running 6-minute marathons and he can easily run and he has the
tolerance.
So like
you were saying, I definitely don't think you should start with running.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, unless you have the tolerance for that, and again, you're not creating a bunch of byproduct in your legs or creating a bunch of soreness, because that happens too. So I think a C2 bike is a great option. If you don't have those, you have a rower, you can do that. It's can get a little challenging on a row because of either grip or low back fatigue, and again, if you're doing a bunch of grip work in your training and then onto a row, that can impact it. So you just need to be very thoughtful about how you do it.
Also, if you do the row, you got to get that thing Becky has. Have you seen that little seat cover she has?
I was gonna give
like
all
jelly.
Becky's recommendations because she made a bunch of recommendations for me to be able to do longer rowing because that was something I needed to do. So I got my gel seat that Becky recommended, and then she also recommended, I was always rowing with my foot pads on a 3. And I went down to a 1, and all of my low back pain during rowing was magical that I've had for 12 years of CrossFit was magically gone.
I mean, it goes to efficiency. Like, that's why we think movement efficiency is so important, because you can alleviate a lot of that pressure or pain that you're going through, especially in the sport of CrossFit, where you're doing all of these dynamic movements, by learning how to move a little bit better.
Now, I feel faster when I'm on a 3 for like a 2K row or a 1K row. But when I'm doing my long Becky 30-minute row thing that she recommended that I do, if I shift it down to a 1, man, it's so comfortable. And I can hold the paces, and my mechanics look way better, and the curve on the monitor looks way better. So there's something to be said for that.
Yeah. So to wrap that one up, yes, I mean, you can add some in. I would start with personally just one session a week and then ease into a second session if you feel like you need it. But my guess, and especially as a master's athlete, who's the one that asked that, there are other things that you still should work on. So just make sure you're prioritizing those things correctly. In the master's categories now, you have to be really strong.
Hold on. Can I be an asshole? Like, those kind of answers would drive me crazy if I was listening, where you're like, start with a one session and then add a second session if you need it. When do I know I need it? Help a brother out.
Yeah, I mean, I think at that point, you probably need to talk to a coach. I would do a full assessment, to be completely honest, because I don't know the person, so I don't know what they need. That's why I keep caveating this with, I've seen everyone in compete. The cool thing about what we do in there is we actually look at the results and we adjust training based on the averages of all the results. We add skill programs based on what people need in the program. Like, we're really trying to make it where it's not just a group program, but people can almost individualize it, right? And that's why we have an endurance option in there. But most people in the sport are actually lacking a strength limit, or they have a strength limitation, or they have a skill limitation. Like, if an athlete comes to me and they can't do any of the gymnastic skills, that has to be priority number one. And if I'm taking time away from that to do a 2-hour zone 2 session, or 30-minute zone 2 session, I would say let's reprioritize this. Work on all the skills, and you'll get your conditioning work in with a well-balanced program, which we have 2 options each week that are in the zone 2 to zone 3. We don't have a ton of just long zone 2 work. That's intentional because, again, we are trying to get the averages. But I just think it's really dangerous if someone just thinks that they need more of that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Cool.
Nice.
What exercises and strategies can be used to enhance muscular endurance in the legs and lower body? Would high repetition lunges and squats within a defined range add weekly? Oh, I don't know what the end of this question is. Sorry.
I think they're saying just basically create some like linear progression.
Yeah.
And
okay.
the answer's absolutely. And we just touched on that a little bit, but yeah, a circuit that I've been doing. I just did it yesterday. It's 20 back squats at 95, 20 drop lunges, because I don't have space in my garage to do walking lunges, and then 20 step ups, no load. So it's 95 pounds for the back squat, 95 pound for the lunge, unloaded box step ups. I do 4 sets of it. I rest the same amount of time that I work. And that's my muscular endurance work that I kind of stack on top of my lots and lots of zone 2 that I've been rebuilding. But the point is, a simple way to progress that is next week I'll do 22, then I'll do 24, then I'll do 26. As long as knees and hips and everything are staying healthy and I'm adapting well, it's a great way to address it.
And you could also add load to that. So you can go from 95 to 105 to 115 in the sport, especially with the performance side of things, that you have to be in that 115 to 135 for a lot of tests. So that's a good way to do it. One of my favorite, and for those that have been in compete, they saw this. It's actually an old Poliquin principle, who he was a bodybuilding coach, but he had some great protocols. It's the 6, 12, 24 concept. So basically you would start with 6 reps at a heavier load, and it would be usually a bilateral movement. So let's say if we kept with Kyle's example, it would be 6 moderate back squats. So let's say at 60 to 75%, depending on where you're at in a cycle. You would rest a certain amount of time. If we're going closer to competition, the rest is going to be a little bit shorter. If it's further away from competition, the rest is a little bit longer. So let's say rest 1 minute, and then you do 12 single leg movements. So now it's 12 walking lunges per leg, and I would lower the load. Obviously, I'm not using the same load as my back squats. I would rest another minute, and then it's 24 of another bilateral movement, but unloaded or with very light load. So 30% or less.
Weighted vest.
A weighted vest. Yeah, you could do weighted vest, really light dumbbell, something like that. So again, 6 back squats, rest 1 minute, 12 walking lunges with whatever dumbbells, rest 1 minute, and then 24 weighted vest squats. And then the next week, you could either add reps to that, or like I like to do with intensity, especially as you get closer, it'd be 6 back squats, and now it's 65%, rest 30 seconds, 12 walking lunges with 5 pounds more in each hand with dumbbells, or in a front rack position for the sport, or whatever movement you want to test, rest 30 seconds, and now 24 weighted vest lunges, but now instead of a 20-pound vest, I use a 30-pound vest.
And something like that isn't really going to detract from strength adaptations.
No.
In fact, for some people, it may help to augment them a little bit. Someone who's like a Mike McGoldrick, they're going to get stronger from doing that.
I've had great success with my own strength gains doing some of that. Again, you can always risk overtraining if you're doing it all the time, but that's a really good way to build some muscular endurance that's kind of in your off season. And the last thing here is if you're wanting to just target stamina, like local endurance, if I'm just thinking about the quads or the hamstrings, you do need to be a little bit careful about what else you're adding in there. If you're doing a bunch of like really hard whatever C2 bike within that, now you're creating other limitations that may pop up. So in other words, I want to do those 24 air squats unbroken and fast, but if I add in a sprint on the bike before that, that's a good way in performance to build for the sport. But in the off season, if I want to focus on having intensity within the movement and targeting a certain muscle group, I probably should eliminate the bike so there's not a lot of other like variables of fatigue, and I'm only focusing on that particular movement.
Yeah, I think also if it is the off season, I'm always thinking I want to get my volume up as high as I can.
There you go.
And doing pre-fatigue work before trying to get your volume up is that's one of the strategies I use to lower volume in season, is to do pre-fatigue work on an erg and then do the movement so I don't have to do so much volume. All right, next question.
Yep. So my legs burn immediately on the Echo bike and C2 bike. What would be progressions for that leg burning issue? Kind of staying on the local endurance.
Okay, so I would say most likely this person hasn't spent enough time on those two ergs, and that they would definitely need to spend time specifically on the Concept 2 bike and the Echo bike. They could start.
Hold on. Yeah. Did that question give any context of what they were doing when it burned? Were they doing the long zone 2 work, or was it like a sprint?
Yeah, no context. So exactly what I read was what was listed.
My guess is that they don't have enough specific adaptation or specific exposure to the bike, and the simplest thing for them is to literally get more exposure on the bike.
Agreed.
Now, someone like that, I might change. If I was their coach, I might change the zone 2 prescription. So rather than just being like, get on the Concept 2 bike, put the damper at 3 or 4 and ride for 30 minutes at zone 2, I would have them put the damper at 10 and do zone 2 work. So yes, their legs are going to be on fire for the entire 30 minutes, but they're still going to stay in zone 2. They're going to probably build up a lot more metabolite, but I'm trying to create local endurance adaptations in that 30 minutes. You do a couple of weeks of that, and they're going to feel much less burning on either erg.
Yeah. If you are talking about like just jumping on and doing a sprint, that's going to be very normal. So you definitely want to make sure that you're warming up well.
Yeah. That's a old Joel Jamieson high resistance intervals protocol.
Just to understand, zone 2 work on any machine, including the run, will help with overall endurance, not to include muscle endurance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the short answer to that. Doing zone 2 work or doing any heart rate zone work on the ergs is going to create non-specific endurance. It's going to improve the cardiovascular endurance overall.
Yes. What you just said, for some reason, and I think we've clarified this enough, but just doing that doesn't mean you're going to get better at CrossFit. Yeah. So keep that in mind. It's the non-specific endurance that you're improving, which will help, which will bleed into the CrossFit work. So you're going to, like to Kyle's point last week, all of a sudden he could breathe better in Metcons, but you still need to make sure that you're focused on that when the season comes to be good at wall balls and handstand push-ups and toes to bar and that's what's so fun and hard about CrossFit. There are so many things that you have to be efficient at and be able to breathe in all these different patterns. So yes, you're building this wonderful base, but you have to be able to bridge it into the sport.
Yeah, to me, erg work like that is really trying to build your recovery ability, to build your baseline fitness. It's building the ceiling. It's not building you up to the ceiling, if that makes sense.
One of the questions earlier was, does zone 2 work, running in particular, we talked about it maybe interfering with strength training. And if you're doing too hard of zone 2 or too much zone 2, it probably could, but there's a huge benefit to that as well, to Kyle's point just now. If you are better at filling your heart with blood, there are some benefits to that, to recovering in between strength sets. So if you're doing heavy back squats and I actually have an efficient heart, then I can recover faster between those sets, which probably means more intensity within the set, which means better adaptations.
Yeah, and if we see more interval style workouts in CrossFit and fitness racing, where it's like, huge. The 2, 2, 2, 3 intervals from the games a couple of years ago, and we've seen more of that. Zone 2 work is one of the best tools that you can have for getting people to recover better between those. You're not going to improve their performance in the 2-minute interval, but their recovery from and the speed of recovery from that 2-minute interval is going to improve.
Yeah. This is a good one. I have a question regarding zone 2. I was under the impression that each zone 2 session had to be in a specific range of time for it to be really effective. So if your goal is to get at least 2 hours per week, you would do 2 1-hour sessions instead of bouts of 10 to 15 minutes here or there. From your perspective and regarding science, is there a difference?
Yes, and this is actually an awesome question. So what I talked about in the last podcast was kind of like, that was how I fitted into my schedule, right? I had 30-minute windows or 40-minute windows that I could do it. I didn't have 2 longer windows, but from an idealistic perspective, you do want to have your zone 2 sessions be longer. Like the magic starts to happen at like 45 minutes and the real magic happens at an hour. And if you can get those extended out, to 90 minutes, that's even better. But I didn't have that time available. And I think part of my point in that last podcast was, even if you don't have these 2 90-minute or 2-hour blocks, or 2 1-hour blocks per week, if you had 4 30-minute blocks, you're still going to get benefit from doing it. In fact, Evan Picon, TTT, former TTT coach, has talked about this a ton, where one of the best things that you can do is put these little chunks of zone 2 throughout the day, 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 10 minutes there, and you accumulate 40 minutes in the day. You accumulate an hour in the day. That's still driving those zone 2 adaptations over time. And I think that's critically important for people to understand, that, like, from an ideal perspective, the longer continuous work is best, right? But I couldn't even run for an hour, like, continuously when I started it. I pretty sure I could now in zone 2. Right? There's no way when I started I could run in zone 2 for an hour. Pretty sure I could do that now, but I also didn't have an hour available. So
why not? Why not bleed into zone 3, or you get fucking bored? No,
I literally couldn't. So there's this thing called heart rate creep. All right. Man, we're getting a lot of science topics in here. It's kind of cool. So what happens is, over time, as you're continuing to exercise and you start to sweat, you lose some plasma volume, you get what's called heart rate creep, where your heart rate at a fixed pace. So say I'm running 9.5-minute miles, and that's my zone 2 pace. Well, 30 or 40 minutes in, my heart rate at that same pace is going to start to slowly creep up. And that's called heart rate creep. It's just a result of, long continuous exercise,
so
sweat
could you
loss.
Just start running slower?
I could, but at some point you're not really running anymore. And the other thing is, when you start to run, this is an experience that happens to me, when I start to run slower than about 10 to 10.5-minute mile pace, then it just starts to hurt. Like, my hip flexors start to hurt. And I think it's a result of my running mechanics at slow speeds not being very good relative to my running mechanics at higher speeds. And that's probably something that, I should talk to Ryan about, and we should work on developing, but it's a common thing. When people run slow enough, man, it starts to hurt. And I've actually heard Evan talk about that. They call it, runners in the runner world, they call it running strength, even though it has almost nothing to do with strength, but it's the ability to run at very low intensities and not have it be damaging.
The endurance of tolerance, right?
Yeah.
Like, learning how to tolerate the positions well.
Yeah.
And for me, it literally is like foot tolerance and knees and hips. Like, I can't do an hour running without having some, like, general mechanical issues. So most people can't do that. Maybe you could do it on a C2 bike. Listen, we've worked with a lot of people, and I've integrated the 10-minute at the beginning, 10-minute at the end multiple times throughout the week, and that has worked really well. There's an ideal way to do everything. Like, if I were to do a strength training program for someone that's in CrossFit, I'd probably pull out almost all of the CrossFit work, but most people won't buy into that because they want to still do all the other things. So there would be an ideal way to have these strength adaptations over, let's say, a summer period. We know that may be better, but because people want other things, you just have to find, like, what's the
Isn't that
the
what
best?
y'all are doing in our strength bias path?
Yeah, we have a strength bias path, but it's like, how many people are willing to buy into that? So we give you the option. Like, this is the ideal option. This is what we want you to do if you need to work on your strength. But we understand that most people probably want to do all the skills and the CrossFit stuff, which is cool. It's great. You can still make good progress there. But if you're just worried about strength, you probably should just focus on this. In the same way, like, if it's just zone 2, then do those longer blocks. Most people don't have that time in the day.
Yeah, at that point, it gets to, like, what's going to make it fun for them and keep them consistent.
And
like,
that's,
if they're going to lose them by
that's
doing
more
the
important.
ideal,
right?
Then go with the next best option.
I think I understand that now more than ever, with having a busy schedule and 3 kids at home. I have to find what works best for my schedule. And if I can stay focused in the time that I have in the gym, it's just better off than being stressed about getting in.
That's a really good point. And there was a question about, time and time commitment. I think it's applicable here. One of the things that I did, this was a long time ago when my kids were much younger than they are now. I bought one of those buggies that attaches to your bike, because one of the things that my kids loved it. They thought it was so much fun.
I remember you telling me about this.
To just, like, speed through the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
But really what I think in the end, one of the things that I got out of it was I was doing a lot of zone 2 endurance work. I say a lot. It was like 30 minutes, twice a week, but my kids wanted to do something fun, and it was an opportunity for me to kind of blend my passion and having an opportunity to do something with kids. But so I think part of this is figuring out how to integrate it into your life. You take your dog for a walk every day, right? You walk for 30 minutes, throw a weight vest on. That'll probably we were talking about this before the podcast. Throwing a weight vest on will probably get you into zone 2. Now you're doing 30 minutes of zone 2 every
Looking
day
like
when
a
you walk your
fucking
dog.
badass while walking your dog.
That's right.
Yeah, I know.
Everyone in the neighborhood is going to
look
be
at that
like,
guy.
Can't stop picking up all these chicks.
It's funny. We have some of those ruck questions, but I've started the ruck process before we actually jump into the program. Kyle and I are writing a program, and we'll post that somewhere. We got to figure out exactly what we're going to do, but.
Have we all started independently?
Yes, we have.
Talked about
Basically, we all talked about it, and we're like, okay, we need to start training because otherwise we won't get through it. But I've been throwing on a weight vest and walking around the neighborhood. And someone the other day came outside, and they're like, I thought Murph was over. It was so funny. Like, everyone knows Murph. And he was just like, he had a good laugh at it. But it is much more challenging walking with a vest on than just, like, I go on walks with our kids every night. But putting that vest on is immediately.
What weight were you at? 60?
Yesterday I put on 65 pounds, which was brutal. But I just have a 20-pound vest, and then I'll usually add like another 10. Yeah, I'll add a little 10-pound plate.
I did a zone 2 with the vest on. I think it was on Friday. Last 20-pound vest on Friday. I did 20-minute ski, 20-minute assault runner, 20-minute Concept 2 bike, and lo and behold, it was so much slower on so I was over 10.5 minute pace to stay in zone 2, and I had to walk at like 6.5 minutes, and then every 2.5 to 3 minutes after that, I had to walk for 30 seconds to bring it back down. So I still hadn't found a sustainable pace, and it would hurt too much. Like, it would actually hurt my joints to run much slower than that. So it's going to take some adaptation for me to really get into this and to be able to do it with, I mean, we are going to have to run with 35. Someone mentioned that the military standard is 45 pounds in the comments. And so
it depends
pounds,
on which selection you go to. 35 is the standard, and then it goes anywhere from 35 up to 55 pounds. Yeah.
Now we got to do 45.
Yeah, that's what I said. Well, you just made this a lot harder.
I did 3-mile runs with 35 pounds, and I have my Apple Watch, and my watch goes to zone 6.
Ooh. That's also another. There are categories that are 1 to 6,
totally
and then 1 to 5.
There?
Oh,
it was
this one goes to 11.
Yeah, this one goes to zone 6.
I got it.
Okay, sorry. I was going to say that there are categories where you'll see 6 zones. So if you hear that, we're talking about 5 zones, which is the traditional
there really
system.
Is some?
Yes, yeah.
The one that I created for the original Training Think Tank Energy Systems course had 7 zones. So it had the 5 traditional, which makes a lot of sense, right? It goes up to basically VO2. And then there is training beyond that. I was a sprinter, and there are multiple zones of sprinting beyond zone 5 that can't be measured by heart rate. Like, heart rate is irrelevant at sprinting intensities, because it's either you're doing speed endurance work and it's at max. There is just nothing else. Like, you're either at your max heart rate or you're not doing it correctly, or there's speed intervals where your heart rate, when you're doing 40-meter repeats on 5 minutes rest, your heart rate barely breaks 120 beats per minute on each one.
But you're putting in max effort for each of those sprints.
Yeah. So that's why in that energy system course, I created 7 zones so that people could have some something to mess with when they got to higher intensities.
Yeah. All right, a couple of training-specific questions. This was great. I'd love to hear more examples of muscular endurance building work, like the 4 rounds of bench press, strict press, and max holds used for handstand push-ups, but for other high-skill movements such as ring muscle-ups, bar muscle-ups, toes to bar, etc.
Heck yeah. So ring muscle-ups, great things to do would be complexes, right? So I would say something, if you look at Mia's breakdown drills that we've got in the Got None programs and Compete, or some of the skill programs and Compete, it would be things like 3 max effort swings, 3 turnovers, 3 strict ring dips, 3 full muscle-ups, right? So that complex right there, and we're starting to see these ring complexes start to show up in the sport.
It fits really well with the sport.
That's a great way to do it. But also, think about things like you do 5 muscle-ups, 5 ring dips, drop down, 5 ring pull-ups. The numbers are probably aggressive for the average level CrossFitter. But then finish with a max rep set of tricep press downs, which is going to work on like the dip out portion. You're not going to get very many sets of that, because once you do a max rep set of tricep press downs,
you're just blown up.
Any pressing that you do after that is going to be destroyed. But things like that, that's how I would approach those complexes.
Yeah, you could also do that Poliquin style concept with this as well, and I've had good success. So it would be, let's just say 3, you'd have to reduce the reps to Kyle's point, because a lot of the upper body stuff you just blow up, like with strict handstand push-ups or upper body pulling, unless you're Kyle and you have lats the size of rhinos. Do rhinos have lats?
Yeah, of course they do.
Do they? Yeah. 3 weighted pull-ups, rest a certain amount of time, maybe 6 ring muscle-ups, or you pick the number where it's well below your AMRAP set, but something that challenges you, rest a certain amount of time, and then chest to bar pull-ups. That's just like a pulling endurance piece that's isolated. You're not creating a bunch of like global fatigue, but it's going to work on, let's say, your lats, your biceps, and then just the ability to have that skill to do under fatigue, rest to full recovery, and then repeat that. And then as you get closer to a season, that's when you can start adding the pre-fatigue work.
Same thing. We talked about some of the West Side progressions and using like repetition method. If you have access to a lat pull down, you could do neutral grip, lat pull down. That's a great tool for building kind of ring muscle up specific pulling that isn't necessarily just doing more of the gymnastics movement. And it's going to let you adjust the load to build, muscular endurance really well. So doing that, and then non-specific stuff to build.
I think more people could do banded pull-ups too.
Yes,
even if you don't need it.
That I actually did.
There's like an ego thing. It's just you get better activation in some of those small. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, by the way, but the smaller muscles and the you just feel a difference. Even if you could do tons of strict pull-ups, you throw like a light green band on there, and you just get better activation.
I mean, it's a great way to. It's kind of like a concept of overspeed training in sprinting. You could do that with a band as well. So that they're
foot assist versions and things like that. Yeah.
And we've used those in our online program. We actually had a full cycle, a 6-week block where we did banded pull-ups each week to help improve that in our off season, so that when we got back to chest to bars and other more dynamic movements, they built that tolerance level that was needed to do that well without getting completely just trashed by doing, 50 or 60 chest to bar pull-ups.
Yeah. McGoldrick loves his banded pull-ups for his pullers.
I gotta work on those pullers. Toes to bar, a couple good ones that I really like doing movements that are replicated in the sport or practicing body lines that are in the sport. So a perfect example of this is maybe like some kind of hollow position hold and then rest so many seconds and then do an L-sit variation, rest so many seconds, and then maybe it's 15 toes to bar for time, come down, and then 10 for time. So 15 unbroken is the goal, and then you'd rest 5 seconds, and now you have to do 10 more for time. So now we're creating some volume, but it's specific to the toe to bar.
Yeah, I think to that point, we've now seen CrossFit start to move in that direction with that GHD V-up row where it's like all trunk flexion, combo movements. But I've been seeing that kind of stuff in Compete forever where it's like one time, I cherry pick Metcons from there to give to my athletes or to do myself. And I saw one that I swear it was 21, maybe 27, 21, 15, 9, toes to bar GHD sit-ups. And I was like, that's horrible.
That was after a bunch of progressions though.
But the point being that is like sport specific trunk flexion, muscular endurance testing, right? Yeah. That's like taking these concepts and moving them into a test. And we're seeing that start to show up in the actual, testing body or the vent structure of the sport. So
yeah, especially with the upper body movements. I think we've always had some endurance tests with the legs, just like, 15-minute AMRAP of rowing and wall balls, like your legs are going to blow up. But now like the density of the upper body pressing and pulling is so high, even when the actual numbers aren't high, the complexity with the weighted vest at semifinals made it much more challenging. So you need to be good at that.
There's a lot of components that go into getting better at this. So we just talked about some kind of more specific things, right? These are stamina-based progressions, but also don't forget that like high volume ski erg, right? Zone 2, 60-minute ski erg is going to build the underlying machinery that allows you to recover faster from that, right? It's going to build all the capillary density, mitochondrial density that lets you recover from that. And then making sure that your mechanics are dialed in for the high skill movements like legless rope climbs, muscle ups, bar muscle ups. Make sure that you have those skill components. Like these are tools to use to improve stamina specific to the sport. But don't forget, there's things that improve recovery, like the zone 2 stuff that we're talking about, and things that actually just make it so that they're easier to do and you can do more of them, like technical work.
I started to smile because Chris and I are doing a 30-minute ski progression right now. So we tested our 30-minute and we're going through these progressions. Yesterday, we did some 1K intervals, but we were both in a hurry. So we're like, let's just not warm up in the very first 1K. Oh, we both looked at each other and we're like, I am blowing up right now. And it's all lat and triceps. Yeah. It's so funny. Yeah. You need to work on it.
You're building the endurance of the pullers.
Very true. Since you guys have discussed high rocks a bit recently, I would like to know how TTT would approach the end of the race, which is mainly muscular endurance. The race ends with a 100-meter walking lunge at 66 and 44 pounds, and then a 1,000-meter run into 100 wall balls. What kind of protocols might be helpful to finish the race out strong?
Hell yeah, that sounds awesome.
I know, I really want to do one. Kyle and I have been talking about this for like 3 or 4 months now. We need to commit to one and do it.
We'll do the one in Texas at some point, but
cool.
We'll see. I have some CrossFit goals that I've got to check off
That's
first.
true. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I'm pushing you away from your actual
here's how we.
So 100-meter lunge, 1,000-meter run, 100 wall balls.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the starting point is going to be specific stuff, right? So
Yes.
I might recommend that you work through that, test it, run it as just that chunk of the race as a test and get a time, right? So, that which we measure, we can improve. So we're going to figure out how long does that take you right now? What does that look like? Plus it'll give you an idea of like, do you have to take breaks? Like, do you have to break the lunges? Can you do them unbroken? Obviously you're gonna have to break the wall ball. Well, maybe not.
Yeah. I'm sure
like
someone could do them unbroken. It's
Travis,
a lot.
right?
Yeah.
Someone like Travis might be able to do 100 unbroken wall ball. Is it a 20 or 30 pound? Does it specify?
I think it's 20, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that might be
someone that does high rocks.
So
let us know.
First and foremost, I would need to know whether or not, like, what does a full test look like, and then we could start to break it down. But I think I would start with doing intervals of that, but like 50, half mile, 50. Is it half mile again?
It's a 1K run and then 100 wall balls to finish.
Yeah, so rather than half mile, probably 500, 600 meter run. And I would run intervals of that and just accumulate volume. So if that's the end of the race, I would try and get 3 or 4 intervals of over 50% of that in, right? So that you're getting significantly more total volume. And that's like build the volume up first, do some volume accumulation, and then I would start to bring it back down and run retests of that. And then at some point before the race, do a full retest. I know that's not as specific as they probably want. They would love to see like this written out as a progression, but I haven't tested it enough, honestly. That would be something where I would have to go in and have, some athletes go and run that full thing, get a better sense of, what's possible there, especially have someone like Travis test it, get a sense of like, what's the high end look like, and then start to break it down.
Yeah. I think the challenge there is that you've already done, it would have been 9K of running, and then all the other, like the sled pull and pushes. And so there's a lot of pre-fatigue before you get to that point. You'd have to obviously train the entire thing. Like you'd have to know that that's an hour and a half race plus for many people. Like I know the world record's in the low 50s, which is just insane, but most people are nowhere close to that. So keep that in mind. It's very long. Like that's a true endurance test. And then if you have a lot of time, you could even isolate that down more. Like if you really struggle with, let's say, the lunges or the wall balls, you could break those down to some of the muscular endurance progressions that we were talking about earlier, where they're just isolated and then eventually go into the test retest. But like Kyle's point on having something that you can measure first is so important in the sport, any sport where performance is the measure. So like make sure you're doing some tests, do your training, and then retest to know that you're actually getting better at that.
And it's even more important for something like high rocks because the test is consistent every time.
Totally.
And so, man, this would be a really in-depth conversation. However, in CrossFit, one of the things I found is it doesn't really help CrossFit competitors to train for the test, if that makes sense. So like you don't use the row wall ball, 15-minute AMRAP from, was it 19.1, right?
Yeah, 2019.
You can train specifically for that, but that isn't necessarily going to make a person better at wall ball and ring muscle up, right? Because the sport's varied and unknown and unknowable, training for a test improves that test, but doesn't necessarily improve them at, the sport of CrossFit. But
the variance of the sport.
When you have something like high rocks where it is that test, that's exactly what it is, then you can train for the test and improve it.
Yeah. I 100% agree. That is a challenge with CrossFit. It's always changing.
Yeah.
It makes it hard, but there are good protocols that you can use. And that's not to say that you shouldn't test and retest workouts. Like if you're particularly working on wall balls and you want to do a 19.1 test retest, you could do that. What Kyle's saying is that may not help you with your thrusters in another workout.
Yeah.
Cool.
Or even wall balls in a different format.
Yeah, for sure. That's it with the training specific questions. The ruck, that was the last thing because we brought it up. We are going to do a 12-mile ruck, but we don't have any details on that. We had a bunch of people ask if they could do it. Chris, Kyle, me, will come up with a game plan for that, and we'll release some information.
I will not come up with a game plan. I will just do whatever you say to do.
Chris's job will be to release said information to the
He's going to make it look pretty. We'll release it. I think we'll just have like a free path on Wada.
That's what I was going to
We'll put it out. You just sign up. You can download the app even if you're not a member and at least, have some fun with us. But we've got to figure all that out over the next week or so.
Is this going to be something that people can add in? Or is it something you should follow by itself?
You could add it in, but if you get to 12 miles, there's a lot of training. You probably want to reduce volume elsewhere, but I think it'll be a fun challenge.
If there are people in our program who jump in, maybe in the water cooler, you help them tell how to take things out or whatever.
My guess is we'll have a couple of sessions per week, probably 3-ish, maybe 4 sessions per week, and one of those is going to be a long session. And whatever day you do the long session on, you should replace all the other training that you've got for the day, and then plan on having a recovery day after. So with the compete structure, it's likely to be your Wednesday or your Saturday session that you'd replace with it. But that's just, me spitballing. And I mean, yes, we've been doing this for a long time.
Sounds like he wants to take over right in the program.
Kyle, do it. Let's go. All right. That is, that's it.
That was all the questions. Okay.
Yeah.
So then I know y'all already went into those. There was I think last time I checked, over 140 something comments.
Yeah.
I know y'all already went in and answered a lot, but anything we missed, y'all jump in and help answer some of those too. So people are like, my question was not answered.
Yeah, we'll go back in and answer those questions. If you have questions on this one, then obviously drop them down below. And
I've created some stuff to help make the training zones, the 5-zone model, to make that a little bit more clear. I created a little thing that we're going to release at some point on just zone 2. It's real short, just like a quick educational piece on zone 2. And then the same thing for the kind of hierarchy of training.
Yeah. I think this gave us a lot of ideas on stuff we can make that'll be separate one-off videos that you'll see starting to come out over time. So
cool.
Pimping ain't easy.
No, it ain't. It ain't.
Someone's got to do it. And it's you, Brannen.
No, it's not me.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks
For listening.